invite the first speaker, the Prime Minister, to start this debate.
Mr. Speaker, members of this House, we believe very strongly that armies, or we know that armies, are an extension of a particular state which has been mandated to protect the citizens of that state from external attack. We also know that in this current day and age, especially with the context of the United States, where you have a large numbers of wars going on with terrorists and all kinds of other insurgent threats, as they call it, we know that there is a large amount of public fear and public apathy towards conscripting for the army in order to try out and help in the, in the actual military service, as they call it. We believe that this conscription stems from a few things. One, images of soldiers dying in countries such as Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan and other nations around the world. And the second issue could just be stemming from the nest or the anti-war sentiment that resides in the US as a whole in the country presently. We also know that such things happened during the 1960s with Vietnam and all the kinds of images that we saw in that regard. But the bigger crux of this debate, Mr. Speaker, is not whether or not the wars are justified or unjustified. The question is, when you have the need to go for a war, and when you have multiple fronts of wars, and your military personnel is not growing fast enough to meet up with that kind of demand, what do? Do you continuously bang campaigns onto people, or do you go for the much softer and easier option of delegating the responsibility of protecting your citizens to a willing foreign entity paid through their government with the United Nations overwatching the transaction? We believe that the latter solution makes a lot more sense in that regard. I'm going to bring to you three substantives in this day. One, why sovereignty can be outsourced and why the need for protection can be, easily subjugated by money in that regard. Two, why money makes it perfectly fine. And lastly, why we need psychologically ready troops as and when threats appear. The first issue we have to talk about is that when we talk about paying armies, we're talking about covering their transport and logistics costs, as well as other things like keeping the soldiers happy and fed. We also mean that we will not give them the general or the actual strategy information that is best left for the generals of the United States. What we'll be simply doing is asking a country such as Bangladesh or Nepal, countries that have huge armies, huge standing armies trained and ready to go, but with no current conflict to go with. We would ask them if they're so willing to be so nice as to rent us their army for a particular period of time until we've dealt with the threat. The generals will come from the US, therefore the intel will remain in the US. No security threats will be dealt with in that regard. Accountability will be solved by making sure that anything that they do in those foreign nations rests directly with the United States of America who hired them. So if there are any kind of human rights violations or what have you, that is entirely the burden of the state that outsourced the work of sovereignty keeping. Firstly, on the idea of sovereignty, we know that, as I've already said, armies are meant to protect a citizen from a particular threat, whether it be terrorism or anthrax, well, not anthrax, but whether it be terrorism and the like of stuff. We believe that this kind of sovereignty can be shared between nations that are willing to go with your cause. The kind of nations that we're talking about here, Mr. Speaker, are those that commiserate with you enough to share what you're trying to do, but are simply not willing to sacrifice their citizens for no kind of compensation and for no foreseeable reason that is beneficial to them. Sovereignty basically works in this regard with war, to being able to go into a nation and ask them kindly if you could use their organs of state to carry out what you require your organ of state to. A similar principle applies in the United Nations, but unfortunately it is only restricted to peacekeeping missions in conflict areas due to internal kind of conflict. The UN limitation does not go for external conflicts, I'll take you in a minute, external conflicts that relate between one country and another, and that is why the sovereignty can be shared in that regard. Go.
First of all, the US is NATO and multiple allies. They're also criticized for fighting too many wars. Don't you think this will exacerbate that problem of making war too easy?
If anything, the fact that they now have to pay for their soldiers would actually make them think twice about fighting many wars, if the justification of the war is your issue. But secondly, our debate is not about whether or not the wars are to be fought or not. We're saying in the occasion of war, when you don't have enough soldiers, when you don't have enough time to train people who are already too scared, what do you do? The second substantive of the day is the psychological readiness that you get with a standing army. Like, we're already talking about people who have been to military training, they've done all the crazy things and sit-ups and all the bunker training, and they're basically ready to go, or lock and load, as we just heard before this debate. We believe that this psychological readiness is imperative, especially at a time when you are in a war situation and your soldiers are dying out. Firstly, because there is a need to have people that are hardened to carry out the task in a professional and trained manner in order to be able to stem out the threat that may exist from the enemy. The second aspect is, by doing this, we require less of the conscription and wasting time efforts on our own citizens in that regard. But lastly, on the idea of why money is justified to be paid to another state. We believe that these states, in essence, are renting us their service and their right to not have their people killed at any particular time. We know war is dangerous, hence why we don't want to merely conscript them for no reason. The payment we give them is almost in essence as to the kind of money that people who work on oil rigs and other dangerous occupations would get. This kind of payment is almost an insurance policy, or as something to give back to the country that is so kind as to help us. We believe money is justified when it comes to war for the following reason. Because we believe, firstly, that though wars may be between one country and another, the greater principle of global policing applies to all countries. But the global need, or the global vision to see a need of area of conflict as important, is only specific to one country or another. We believe that by sharing this responsibility and incentivizing others to share this responsibility, we will be furthering the ease of working together when it comes to issues of international relevance, such as wars, such as terrorism, and the like. But lastly, on the second mini idea of the fact that money generally stems out a common hope and helping these countries that may need the money in that essence. Most of these countries, Mr. Speaker, that have exceptionally large standing armies do need the money in one regard or another. The army generally tends to be a massive burden on state budgets because of the amount of people they have and the amount of funding and eating that these people have to do and whatnot. We believe that compensating these countries is a fair way for the amount of the outsourcing resource that they have with us, and that we should be able to cooperate with them in future wars on terrorism and the like. We think that this debate is essentially about what do you do when your options are limited and you need to do it now. Thank you.
Right, thank the Speaker for his speech, and invite the first Speaker of Opposition now, the Leader of Opposition.
Here.
We in opposition believe that war is the greatest evil there is, and we have to do everything we can to prevent it from happening and to make sure that the harms we avail of it are as contained as possible. That's why we don't think that states should be allowed to buy armies and outsource them, because we think it's counterintuitive to exactly how war is treated and how war is prevented and how the harms are mitigated, Mr. Speaker. That's why we don't agree the policy should stand. 3 points of rebuttal before I move on to what I want to argue. First, I want to discuss their policy, because they merely said that states are free to outsource their military operations when it comes to war. But we think this is open to a lot of options. For example, what are your regulations and policies regarding where accountability lies? Does it solely lie on the origin state? Does it solely lie, Mr. Speaker, on the state that was outsourced, Mr. Speaker? Because coming from them, it wasn't very clear how exactly strategy was going to be pulled out. Is it going to be solely originated from the origin state? Is it solely going to be decided by that outsourced state? Because we saw this with the example of Blackwater, for example, where they were outsourced with the condition that they have to do it with their own rules. We say it's important for you to establish accountability because you're expanding the scope of war. You're expanding it to something where necessarily alliance may not be present. So how do you establish accountability? But more than that, we say, are there even limitations to operations? Are you only preventing it to only on-site wars? Or do you allow, for example, for the options of proxy wars, of having these operations, Mr. Speaker, outsourced to even different locations? We think, Mr. Speaker, it's so unacceptable for government not to pose these considerations, especially considering that what they're doing is essentially enlarging the scope of war and who's involved. We think it's unfair for them not to set these kinds of limitations. Secondly, I want to talk about this idea of how they characterize the states who were most likely going to be outsourced. Coming from Prime Minister, he said that most likely these are the states who commiserate with you, who have the same intentions of engaging in war, but they just don't want to because they don't want to sacrifice their citizens and things like that. We say, if that's the case, why do you want to embolden the states to be unable to engage in war? Because we think the mere fact that they're deterred from engaging in war because they don't want to sacrifice their citizens is a value in itself. Because in that case, you prevent war as much as possible. We don't understand why they think it's good that you enable other allies, Mr. Speaker, in principle, to be unable to have the harm of wars as well. We think it's good that as much as possible, they are deterred from engaging in these wars. But more than that, we think that if they're emboldened to engage in these wars by you supplying them, then their fear is not absent. Because we say, if their fear is that their citizens are going to be compromised because of this, we think that's still going to be present if you outsource it, and that's exactly what I want to argue later on. But more than that, number 3, they have this menial problem of how, for example, these nations may need that money to compensate for their militaries, may need their money for other things. We say that's not the point. If they need money, there are other legitimate purposes for you to grant them this kind of money. We don't understand why this is a legitimate purpose. We think it's not. As leader of opposition, I'm going to be arguing largely on how you affect the dynamics of war and how this policy, in fact, is counterintuitive to how the international community sees war and how it should be declared and treated. My deputy will argue to you largely on the ideas of violence and the military. What are their purposes and why should it stay that way? But before we move on, yes.
Sir, when you tell me that we shouldn't enable, our allies to be propagated to the harms of war, but juxtapose that, sir, to your own army or your own conscription failing, what then is your solution to that apathy, sir?
If your country is the one who believes that it has to engage in war, why is it that other countries have to get the cost of it? We don't understand why that's justified. If you believe, Mr. Speaker, that war has to be fought for your country, we think it's justified that you have to be accountable for your decisions and you have to be the one who suffers for it, Mr. Speaker. And we think that's good that these countries have these considerations in place, because in that way, we deter them from waging wars as much as possible and to exhaust all the primary measures as much as possible. I want to argue, first of all, Mr. Speaker, why this policy dangerously magnifies the scope of war. Because we say, Mr. Speaker, in status quo, even if it's a war between your country and your enemy, inevitably, there is going to be destruction and a loss of life. So you've seen that in all the wars that had happened. Inevitably, even if you have regulations against collateral damage, they still happen, Mr. Speaker. And what's worse is, Mr. Speaker, they are justified. And already, when it comes to the fact that it's confined between two nations, that's already horrible enough. But we say, when you add in outsourced actors, Mr. Speaker, or outsourced entities, we have to consider the fact that reasonably, it's not going to be contained to on-site operations only. Because we've seen it in the Korean and Vietnamese war, Mr. Speaker. They have the propensity even to proxy their wars, to have these particular attacks in those nations, Mr. Speaker. And we think what's worse is that the proxy on the initiative, Mr. Speaker, is on the initiative of outsourced nation. We say, if you characterize the enemy, are we supposed to expect that they will act rationally? Are we supposed to expect that they know this country is only being paid to wage the war, so therefore we're not going to attack them? We think, Mr. Speaker, it's not reasonable to believe. We say, as a defensive mechanism, Mr. Speaker, what's reasonable to believe is that they're going to incur destruction on that nation as well, to disenable that nation, Mr. Speaker. And we think because of that, not only are they in war with the original nation, but it extends in the scope of the outsourced nation as well, Mr. Speaker. And we think, Mr. Speaker, it's a legitimate offensive because if you tell them they can't do this, it's unfair because they're being attacked by that nation. Inevitably, Mr. Speaker, the harms are compounded, Mr. Speaker, not only between two nations, but between other actors as well who were paid for, Mr. Speaker, because we think it's reasonable to believe that as a defensive and offensive tactics, your enemy is going to expand its operations as well, not precluding as well the idea of them paying other actors. We don't think, Mr. Speaker, it's justified for you to add other actors, especially since you've established that they can be reasonably deterred. We think, when the international principle is to reduce the harms of war and to deter it as much as possible, we think they're doing the opposite of that, and that cannot be acceptable. Secondly, I want to argue how you embolden the pursuit of war, because we think this particular policy fundamentally makes war more convenient, Mr. Speaker, and we don't want that. How is this so? First, because they themselves conceded that it's the easier option, Mr. Speaker. And easier option because you get rid of the costs and things like that. But more than that, we think number two, it's even easier to achieve war because accountability is blurred. It's so easy to pinpoint others when wars of crime have been committed. And more than that is the fact that the ICC isn't even very credible nowadays because they haven't persecuted anyone or no tangible punishment was met. We think, Mr. Speaker, if the international community concedes, and there's a plethora of rhetoric to achieve, Mr. Speaker, the fact that lives have to be protected as much as possible, that harm has to be prevented as much as possible, we think this policy should fall completely. Thank you.
Good. We thank the Speaker for his speech and invite the second Speaker of Government now, the Deputy Prime Minister. Enthusiastically.
Mr. Speaker, we find a couple of problems. We find problems with what the leader of opposition is bringing into this case. First of all, he questioned the whole incentive idea of the money. Why should we be paying people to actually take upon the role of the government and our responsibility as a government? We think that is not mutually exclusive to paying your own citizens to engage in a war. So we don't think that it is particularly different with paying another country, and we don't find anything particularly wrong with that. But not only that, he comes and tells us that somehow, if we really want to be paying these countries and somehow, we want to give them money, we should just find other ways and give them money. First of all, we're just outlining the benefits that will come about from this model to the countries that are willing to engage with us in this war, or in offering their troops to fight with us in that war. We're not saying that we're somehow looking for a way to benefit them and help them out. We're just saying that we'll be paying them for the services rendered. It's just the benefit or whatever they'll be getting some sort of monetary benefit from this war that they'll be engaging with us as the United States. Please sit down. Also, he came and told us that somehow it is wrong for us to engage in this war because what if these countries will be forced to come upon into this war, like if it's Afghanistan that is coming with the troops with the United States, what if these other countries or the enemy actually attacks Afghanistan? First of all, we already told you that it will be upon the willingness of the country to engage in the war. So we think that it is an informed choice of the harms that might be implicated upon the country. They'll be aware of the harms that might exist. We're just telling you that here we are, we're the United States, we need a couple of guys to come and fight with us to beat these guys at whatever war we'll be engaging upon. Please sit down, and therefore we want you to join along. It is all about willingness. The countries will be deciding themselves. We're not forcing them to join us. We're just offering an incentive for them to join us and combat this war. Please sit down. The other issue he also talked about is the pursuit of war and how somehow we should be stopping, the whole idea of pursuit of war and the embodiment of war and so on and so forth. First of all, we already explained to you that there are already wars that the United States is engaging upon. As much as we don't want to be engaged in those wars, we're already in them. War is not something that countries voluntarily, willingly want to engage upon at any given moment. It's not something that people generally want to be involved in, but we're already in it. The situation is dire, and the time sensitivity of the issue is immediate. And therefore, we think it is convenient for us to outsource this kind of war, whatever war we're engaging upon, to other countries, seeing as we have an apathy issue which they didn't even try to solve, and seeing as we within the United States, the citizens are not willing to engage in these wars. So that in itself is an issue, and we think because of the time sensitivity and the convenience of these standing militaries, it is better for us to do this. We do not want to be engaged in war. We do not want to be we are not supporting the idea of war. We don't want to be out there killing people. It's always a bad thing. However, it is what it is, and no matter how much we can avoid it, we're already in it, and therefore we need to solve the problem now. Also, they talked about accountability. We think that accountability exists. The international community is always there to make sure that even if anything that these people outstep their boundaries, there will be checks and balances in place. The international community, the American citizens themselves will also be there to make sure that no harm exists in these wars. Yes.
Just because we're in war already doesn't mean it's okay for you to do anything you can.
Yeah.
Why is it okay for you to extend the scope of the war and the scope of the harms as well?
First of all, we already explained to you that this is not about whether the war is justified or not. We're already at war, and therefore we're doing everything we can to make sure that we end the war. It's not about whether the war is justified or not in that regard. So we don't think that is the main issue of this debate. We explained to you, even if they came and told us about expanding the scope, we told you that accountability lies with the United States for whatever happens in that regard. We told you we'll be using the generals of the United States, so intel and everything that they'll be doing will be solely responsible by the United States. So we don't think that is an issue. Please sit down, right? So what am I going to talk to you about? I'm going to talk to you about the willingness of other countries to be involved in war. Now, the UN and NATO, as they pointed out in the POI, are countries we can use that, and why do we need to go to this extent? We tell you that there's generally unwillingness of these countries to be involved in war, seeing as there is no incentive, and also there's a probability and a likelihood of there to be failure because of this unwillingness, as we've seen in the past. UN peacekeepers or NATO have not necessarily been always as successful in whatever end of war that might be going on. So we think that by offering an incentive to these countries, outsourcing whatever service that we might need from them, better makes it easier for us to achieve the goal that we're going for, especially in war. We don't think that we should depend entirely on the UN and NATO for whatever wars that are going on, and therefore we think it is necessary for us to take this. We also think it is the role of the state to win the war, all right? So no matter how much we don't want to be in that war, at the end of the day, it must end and we must win it, and that is something that the United States holds itself against. We think that the United States has an image to uphold. We've seen there have been problems with mercenaries in the past, and we don't want to repeat the same issue. The beauty about a military is that when you have militaries always follow orders. Because the United States is the one responsible for dispersing these orders, we think that it is better for us to uphold the image and the ideals of the United States. Yes.
Well, which one? Why do you refuse to justify the goals of these war? Your premise of your argument is that these goals are good. Question the validity and the veracity of these statements.
Well, we think it is not necessary for us to justify the wars, because at the end of the day, it wasn't always, we didn't want to be in those wars. Like, we didn't go out and say we want to fight and things like that, but we're already in the wars and they're already ongoing. And even if, please sit down, and even if we can justify and look for the reasons behind it, at the end of the day, we need to solve the problem that is ongoing and the lack of personnel that we have within war. So we don't think that justification of the war is the scope of the debate. Now, moving on to mandatory conscription and mercenaries. As I already said before, we're having an issue with the avenues existing within status quo to solve the problem that the Prime Minister had set out in the beginning. There's lack of motivation that exists with conscription and mercenaries and the UN and the NATO. There is lack of motivation. We cannot deny the fact that rewards get the job done, and we think that as the United States, it's our right and it is within our mandate to do this, to protect not only our citizens but whatever war that we're engaging in. Lastly, we also think that this will better help us cooperate with these countries, so that in the essence that when we pay them, they will not always feel obligated to negotiate, say, with our enemies, the terrorists, or whatever else the case may be. So we think that this better helps us also cooperate with these countries, makes it also difficult for them to also cooperate with terrorists who might be incentivizing them with monetary gain. And that is why we think we should take this debate.
Right, thanks Speaker for her speech, and now I invite the second Speaker for opposition, the Leader for opposition, Deputy Leader for opposition.
let's engage 3 points before we continue with my argumentation. On the first level, on the entire issue of money, because they said just because you give out money to another country, then they're going to be automatically be your ally, and you're going to walk hands and do everything together. But we tell you it's not as easy as that, because we have to analyze the motivation of individual countries in engaging the war. Is it really just about money, or is it because of the entire global dynamics that is present in status quo? Because we tell you that money is a very menial issue, and even it's a very menial incentive that you can give at the end of the day. But more than that, they never really specified how much they are going to give and they are willing to shed. Because if it's too small, then no one will engage. But if it's too big, then you're just creating a cycle of dependence to these countries, to your own country, which, by the way, a dependence that's not even sustainable, and this is dependence just because of money alone. Because we all know that US is in recession, and I know it's a petty point, but it's still worth considering. But secondly, if it is not, money does not size up to the entire kind of harms that we are creating when we engage in war. How can you pay for the lives of the soldiers? Or how are you going to pay for the kind of infrastructure that you created? No response coming from government bench. But more than that, the end goal they've presented are two things. On the first idea is they want to end the war at the end of the day. All well and good if you can achieve that. But we tell you, they never really explain how. Because if you are going to pull in a lot of other countries into the war, you are just prolonging the war, engaging other people in war, and even creating a propensity for the country that you are attacking to attack the countries you pulled into that war. And that does, ladies and gentlemen, just make the war even longer at the end of the day. But more than that, if you really want to end the war, you have to ensure accountability. But accountability, according to them, just only lies on the United States. Then, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, the people that they're going to hire can just do anything they want, wreak havoc in what they want, because after all, US will be the one who's going to be accountable. Where is ending the war there? But more than that, there was a menial point coming from the previous speaker that she said that, we are going to promote cooperation among countries. Cooperation because of money. Is it sustainable? We tell you no. We want genuine cooperation, and that's what I'm going to talk about that later. But more than that, they talked about the entire idea of apathy, and their solution is to buy out military. Number one, if you are just making your people more apathetic, because now you don't need to rely on your people to defend on your sovereignty. You can just buy out if you have money. I don't know, to a poor country like the Philippines, where we are from. More than that, it's not even sustainable. If you don't have money anymore, how are you going to defend your own country? No response, ladies and gentlemen. That's the kind of harm that we are telling you, and that's what we are preventing. But lastly, on her first argument of unwillingness of nations to engage in war and what have you, is it really money that is motivating them and stopping them from engaging in war? We tell you no. I'm going to spell out three. Number one is they don't have their own soldiers be killed, or they don't want to dip their foot on the issue of other people, or lastly, they just don't want to engage war because they themselves are protecting their own citizens, which, by the way, is their own priority. Yeah. We tell you, with all those reasons, that kind of unwillingness is not going to be solved by your money. It's only just going to create more harms at the end of the day. Two arguments for you. Number one is I'm going to talk about how to incentivize nations to be independent from other nations in creating their own power within their own sovereignty. But secondly, I'm going to talk about the principle of engaging in war should only be within the country and should not spill to other nations and create more problem at the end of the day. On the first idea, government's premise in incentivizing in protecting the country is that there are countries that are suffering from apathy of its people to be part of the military. Therefore, no one wants to protect their nation anymore. In effect, they said that you are lessening the power. We beg to disagree, ladies and gentlemen, because this is not true. Because number one, nationalism and national pride always take supremacy. Even if there are people who are apathetic, probably there are still a good handful pool of people who are willing to engage in the military in protecting your sovereignty, in protecting your affinity to your own country, in protecting your ancestors at the end of the day. But more than that, if people are really that apathetic, there are other means that you can engage in. Like, for example, you can make military more enticing. Like in the Philippines, they give very big incentive for people who go to the Philippine Military Academy. Or for example, we can take the model of Singapore, Taiwan, Switzerland, wherein we are going to force people to have military service at the end of the day. If apathy is your problem, then all of it can be solved in the model coming from opposition. Why do you have to buy out military, buy out your force, incurring more harm to yourself and even to other countries, and even protracting and prolonging the war at the end of the day? Because we tell you that there is an inherent value to keep the power within your own country and to ensure allegiance to your own country, accountability, and protection through sustainable methods that we are forwarding. And this is the only exclusive benefit. This is the exclusive, one of the many exclusive benefits coming from a negative side. But secondly, I'm going to discuss the entire idea of engaging war and why we should, in principle, why is it wrong to pull in other people. And this is where I'm going to talk about the idea of right intentions. Force can only be used for just cause. Suffered wrong is considered a right intention, while material gain or maintaining economics is not. The war on terror, for example, is justified because you are protecting the people who died in the 9/11 or the bombing in Pentagon. Or even, ladies and gentlemen, wars against oppressive leaders is justified because you are protecting humanity and you are preventing the slippery slope that you are going to create at the end of the day. These right intentions are the ones that are not just in line with international protocols, but assure security and deterrence among people to just engage in war just because they want to. This is in line with the idea that we should make war as hard as possible for all countries to engage in. What the proposal is doing is that you are sending country, not only your own country, but another country into a very vulnerable situation. Vulnerable that you are going to incur unnecessary costs to your own country and other countries, or even money from your own country and other countries as well, and you are increasing the rhetoric of people that they don't want more at the end of the day. Because if you are going to look at the decision-making process, this is normally does not come up with a consensus. After all, they never talked about it. We are then safe to assume that it's just a unilateral action by the government. This just creates an illegitimate government at the end of the day, and we don't want that. We want legitimate government, strong force of the nation to protect their sovereignty, and you can only achieve that in opposition. Thank you.